Organizing your scene is very important. Oftentimes you will have a model composed of a lot of components. For example, I have one object for the main body, and then lots of smaller objects for the rest of the model. In my outliner, which if you do not have open is this second to bottom button right here, will give you a list of everything in your scene. I have the default cameras, light, and object sets, and then I have these two groups. One of them is named and one of them is not named. For my drone low underscore GRP, which stands for group, if I click on the plus sign, I'll see that I have subgroups with some other objects in it. If I shift left click, I'll open up the entire group and I'll have a list of all objects and groups in that group. If I do shift and left click on the minus sign, it will all close. You know that something is a group when it has this italicized rectangle with an arrow on it. You should have a plus sign next to it. If you do not, like this one, that means it's an empty group. There is nothing in it, and I can just delete that. If it has this square with 4 smaller squares in it, that means it is a mesh. This top group that I have is called Polysurface 12. And this is a common naming convention you'll get when you do a lot of duplicating and combining and separating. It'll just give it a default name, which is not great. And sometimes you'll have very bad organization like this. To rename a group, all you have to do is double click on it. Now I'll call this Top Light GRP. You don't have to end your group name in GRP. I just like to do so to make it easier for me to identify what is a group and what is not a group. And I don't want all of these subgroups. There's a few different ways you can get rid of them. You cannot left click and drag. If you left click and drag, you will just select. If you want to move things around in your outliner, middle click and hold and drag it. If you have a straight dotted line, that means you're just going to move it to that location. If you have a box around it, that means it is going to be in a new group. It's technically not a group, it's called parenting, but it works in a very similar way. What I want to do is just get rid of this organization, because this is a lot of extra stuff that I would have to clean up. And one thing you can do is select everything, and I'm just going to hit Control G, or come up to Edit and Group. Now when I open it up, you can see that it got rid of a lot of that bad organization, and now I just have everything in one group. So let me rename this. And then I can go through and name all of my sub-meshes. You can rename them just by double-clicking on them. And then hit Enter when you are done. I just finished organizing and naming everything in that group. And now I want to combine it with this existing group with everything else in it. So I'm just going to middle click the group and drag it into the other group. Now I open it up, I have it right there at the bottom. So I have this one group that controls all of the meshes of this object. Sometimes when you're working, you'll want to hide objects, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. The easiest way is to select a mesh, and you can come up to Display, Hide Selection, or do Control H. However, they have simplified it, and you can just hit H, and that will hide your object. If you want to undo that immediately after you hit it, you can just hit Z. You don't have to hit Control Z, just Z, and you will have that back. One helpful hint If you don't know where this object is in your outliner, because you do get a lot of groups, you can hover over your outliner with your object selected and hit F, and it will open up the groups and show you where that mesh is located. Then I can hit H to hide it, and you can see that it is grayed out. It is a slightly darker gray. To bring it back, I can select it and hit H again to unhide it. You can also hide objects in your channel box. With this visibility, it is set default to on. If you just select it and type off, it'll be the same thing as hitting H. If I want to just work on this main body mesh, I could select everything and then deselect the mesh and then hit H. However, that'd be much more difficult to unhide everything. So instead, there's another tool that will hide unselected objects, and it's called the Isolate tool. And there's two different ways to get to it. Make the selection of the object that you want to keep, and you can come up here to this button. It is a small square with an arrow, and when you select it, everything that is not selected will disappear. Select it again, and it will come back. You can also hit Control 1, and that will activate Isolate. Another useful organizational tool are layers. And layers work very differently in Maya than they would in something like Photoshop. And they are display layers. So I'm going to make a selection of this main body, and in the channel box at the bottom you will have a tab that says Display, and under it you have Layers, Options, and Help. You also have these 4 buttons. I'm going to click on Layers, and you can create an empty layer, or you can create a layer from selected, which is what I am going to do. I now have layer 1 with a V, a P, and a blank square. The V is for visibility, and I can turn that layer on and off. You don't have to worry about the P. If I come to this third square, I hit it once, it will be transparent. It will not be selectable. However, I will be able to see the wireframe. And if I hit it one more time, it will be a reference layer, which means it'll be visible. However, it'll be not selectable. This is really helpful if you have some objects that are very carefully placed and you don't want them to accidentally get moved around. Let's say if you make a selection, you don't want that one object to move. A reference layer can be very, very helpful. If you hit R one more time, it will be turned off and it will act as it normally does. You can add more objects to a layer by selecting them, right-click on the layer, and add selected objects. You can also remove objects by right-clicking and going to Remove Selected Objects. To rename a layer, double-click on it, and you will have your edit layer. I'll call this Main Body. Unlike everywhere else in Maya, if you have a space here, it will not automatically put in an underscore, and it will not allow you to rename it. So you do need to have that underscore or have no spaces. To delete a layer, right-click on it and go down to Delete Layer. That does not delete the objects that are inside of the layer. You can also use these buttons here. If you hover over them, it'll tell you what they do. Create a new layer and assign selected objects. Create a new layer, and then you can move layers up and down in the organizational list. Layers are used most commonly when you're bringing in reference images to work from. You don't want your reference images to accidentally be moved around, so if you have a front and a side view of what you're modeling, you could put them on a reference layer and make them unselectable. Reference layers are also very helpful when you are making a sky dome. A sky dome is a very large light that goes all around your scene, and wherever you look, it is always selectable. So I often like to put it on a layer and make it a reference layer so I cannot select it anymore.